Hi, everyone. Welcome and good morning. Thank you for joining us for our 19th Columbia University Annual Social Enterprise Conference, Capital for Good Digital Series. During this year, under the pandemic, the series is a virtual space for showcasing social impact leaders who are deploying capital to generate sustainable solutions to global systemic challenges. So we hope today and the upcoming events in this series serve as a forum and hallmark for creating a space for the exchange of new ideas and best practices on mission-driven businesses and social impact leaders. I wanted to share a quick slide with you all about the focus of this series. Let me just switch over. Can you all just give me a thumbs up that you can see the slide? Terrific. So the spectrum of capital for good that this conference covers spans ESG investing through to impact investing, strategic philanthropy, and philanthropy. And it's both the sources and uses of capital to address social and environmental problems that are facing us in the US and around the world. So just to keep in mind with today's discussion, the role that capital in the many different forms that it can appear and how it might be harnessed to tackle some of the challenges that are facing the industry. So this is sort of a way to think about how we segment the field of capital. You know, capital, like other tools like technology, can be used for good and ill. And, you know, we take a unapologetically optimistic view that when we explore these topics, we're looking to use all the tools in our toolkit to tackle social and environmental problems. And resources, finances, funding, and capital is a really big part that can influence the creation of innovative business models, innovative ideas, and help scale things to broad usage. So with that, I wanted to stop the share, and Matan, if you can just switch us back over if needed. But today we are going to hear from some organizational leaders in the journalism industry and to deeper dive into the various business models within news organizations to ensure that not only do they tell stories that readers want to hear, but also what the influence of capital and donors in particular, which are increasingly becoming influential in journalism. As you know, just reflecting on where we are in the country and with the most recent craziness around the election and the role of media and journalism and the critical role that media plays in shaping people's perspectives of the world. This is such an important discussion today, and really thrilled to see so many of you who registered for this event or are viewing this event after today. So with that, I'd like to bring up to stage one of our terrific Star Social Enterprise Conference co-chairs, Madison Skinner. Madison, over to you. Thank you so much for pulling us all together today.
Thank you, Sandra, and good morning, everyone. I'm very excited to see so many of you joining us for this week's digital event series. As Sandra mentioned, I'm Madison Skinner, co-chair of the 19th Annual Social Enterprise Conference Capital for Good and a current MBA student at Columbia Business School. I believe that many of us in the audience today have an interest in journalism, myself included, and building sustainable funding models for news. And today we are so lucky to be joined by our panelists who will discuss the strengths and weaknesses of different funding models and how to balance reporting the news, curating the news that the people want to read and that is critical to democracy. It is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. We have Kaizar Campwala, who is a current vice president of news at Disney. He oversees the streaming and digital businesses at Good Morning America, ABC News, and 538. Prior to Disney, Kaizar co-founded and served as president of Cal Matters, a state house reporting organization in Sacramento, led Stitcher's business development team during the podcast company's formative years, and was entrepreneur in residence at Al Jazeera. We also have Nick Chen, co-founder and CEO of Pico, which is a business platform empowering experts to sell information and ideas online. Nick started the company with his childhood friend and Stanford classmate, Jason Bade, primarily out of a deep concern for the sustainability of the Fourth Estate, a core pillar of our democracy that is dependent on journalists like Nick's sister, CNN national correspondent Natasha Chen. We also have Sherrell Dorsey, CEO and founder of The Plug. The Plug is a digital news and insights platform covering the Black innovation economy. Sherrell's work has been featured in Vice, The Washington Post, The Seattle Times, The Information, and more. She has been a contributing writer for notable publications like Columbia Journalism Review, Fast Company, Black Enterprise, and others. In 2018, she was named an Inspiring Woman in Tech by CNET. We also have Elizabeth Green, CEO and founder of Chalkbeat and the American Journalism Project. She is, a board chair of the American Journalism Project. Since launching in 2014, Chalkbeat's reporting has spurred changes in education funding, legislation, policy, and practice, and is regularly cited or republished in dozens of publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, and Vox. Chalkbeat focuses on education reporting at a local level in the US. Elizabeth is also the co-founder and board chair of the American Journalism Project, the first venture philanthropy firm dedicated to local news. Her book, Building a Better Teacher, was a New York Times bestseller and notable book of 2014. And we also have Sibel Lowin, Global Partnership Solutions Lead at Google News Initiative. Sibel is currently focused on co-leading the Digital Growth Program, which aims to help small to mid-sized news organizations globally grow their digital businesses. Prior to Google, Sibel also worked in strategy at Amazon and the New York Times. And finally, we have Josh Benson, who will be moderating today's conversation, who is a partner of Old Town Media. Josh, along with his fellow founders, helped establish publishers and new startups to achieve sustainability and growth. He has helped launch and continues to advise a number of award-winning journalist-owned publications, including The Colorado Sun, Block Club Chicago, and Documented. Prior to Old Town Media, Josh has co-founded and co-edited Capital New York, led Politico's expansion into state and local news, and started his career in journalism at the New York Observer and the New York Times. And now I'm going to hand it over to Josh. Thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate with this panel of brilliant practitioners who are actually finding out useful things about how we can grow in this troubled industry of ours. Sibel, I'm going to start with you, just because you've got such a high level view of such a diversity of experimentation going on, and because you are now you're working with an organization that has a special, if not unique, ability to put real substantial capital behind the experiments that are working. So if you could highlight one of the experiments that you think is particularly underattended right now or underappreciated, and which makes you personally think, I would really love Google to throw much more money at this one because it has potential to scale. Could you please tell us about that?
Sure. So one thing that we launched is called local experiments, which is essentially our goal is to look at underserved communities where there isn't necessarily a local news organization there yet, and partner with industry experts to launch something from the grounds up. So far, we've launched 4 organizations across the UK and the US, and the principles while launching this program are, we decided that we should, focus on revenue streams that go beyond just digital display advertising. We should collaborate in true partnerships within those communities, not just transactional, let's say transactional partnership. And then also build revenue at the same time as building an audience, which is obviously very difficult when you're starting a news organization from the grounds up. And So far we have 4, as I mentioned, and I think it's going to be very interesting to keep seeing how these evolve. But we've been seeing great results. And just one quick example is, for example, there's this product as part of this that we have been experimenting with called the Community Leaders Program. So one of these 4 publications called Mahoning Matters in Youngstown, Ohio. And basically they decided to create a section where they work with a local organization that sponsors a specific section of the news. And they're able to really create something that both the community values a lot. So they launched something called, I think, the Movers and Makers, which is sponsored by the Farmers National Bank. And they highlight stories of local entrepreneurs and business owners that get a lot of readership, at the same time a sustainable revenue stream, because the bank basically is providing on a regular basis predictable revenue streams, which is so important when starting out a company from the ground up. So this is just one example, but obviously would love to hear from others as well.
No, well, it's a great example, and the name of the game right now seems to be growing those non-traditional revenue streams as obviously as digital display advertising revenue streams kind of get winnowed or collapse entirely. Nick, I can ask you a similar question. Speaking of those non-traditional revenue streams, Pico itself is a fast-growing company on the strength of, a number of its sort of burgeoning new clients, right? And the focus seems to be, correct me if this is, incomplete, but it seems to be built around different forms of reader-derived revenue, right? So memberships and subscriptions and so on. So you've got, Lookout Local, a new enterprise in California. You've got, of course, the Defector, which is the sort of post-Deadspin pirate ship that's now at 30-odd thousand subscribers. Our friends at Colorado Sun, Block Club Chicago, and so on. I'll ask you a little bit of a mirror image question, the one I asked to Sibel. I do want to know what you see that is working, that is kind of widely applicable, and that you wish you'd see more news organizations doing, but also, what are the limitations of those lessons? Because, sometimes would-be journalism founders look at these groups that seem to be making it look easy, and, maybe they're missing something important there. So where are the limits of these lessons?
Yeah, well, I'll first say that, the examples you named, and there are so many more, you could say, okay, these are all recurring revenue business models, right? They're all memberships, subscriptions. There's some nuance in that terminology, but generally speaking, that's how everyone refers to them. But there is so much innovation possible in terms of figuring out what the product looks like. What is your audience getting in exchange for that recurring payment? Really access. Because I think a lot of people think about memberships and they think about access to content. It can be more than just access to content. And even within the umbrella of access to content, it could be on-site access versus newsletter access versus time-based access, early access, right? So many different variables that you can play around with that all fall under this broad umbrella of memberships. So a lot of opportunity to innovate there, to try new things. I think the broadly applicable advice is think about this as a product market fit challenge. There is no one size fits all solution here, which makes it quite different from the days of ad tech, right? Here, you really have to understand who your audience is, what their habits are, what their interests are, and really cater your product to them. I think, Colorado Sun, which was mentioned earlier, Block Club Chicago, Defector, I have to admit, they're great success stories, right? But prior to launching, prior to using Pico, they had years building up that trust with an audience. right? That's something we don't talk about often, right? You know, Pico would gladly take credit for their success, but obviously that's not true, right? Colorado Sun were a bunch of folks coming from the Denver Post, Block Club Chicago from DNA Info, Defector from Deadspin, right? And it takes time to build up that audience, to build up that trust, to build up that sense of product market fit. So if you're brand new to the game, you don't have an audience yet, you know, don't feel bad if you can't figure it out overnight. If you don't get, you know, thousands of subscribers in the first week, it takes time.
So time in this case is almost literally money, right? So absent the ability to do what you just described, right? Like with the Deadspin crew, the reason these subscribers, including me, kind of materialized overnight for them is that they had this big following, they had a bunch of loyalty, and they had a compelling story to tell, right? They're sort of fleeing the clutches of the rapacious new owner and wanted to do their own thing. And so like, great, who's not gonna follow that banner, right? So terrific. The question I think we should talk about a little bit here, in addition to these very challenging revenue questions, is the access to capital in the first place, right? So if you don't have the ability to sort of conjure 30,000 paying subscribers before you launch, then you've got to be able to sort of live while you build your audience up. So Sherrell, you are pulling off this magic trick before our very eyes, right? You've built a publication that is covering rising Black innovation ecosystems. Clearly, this is an opportunity that's born of a lack of diversity in some of the sort of dominant business coverage that we see in the first place. You started off by bootstrapping. You've now successfully raised some money. Can you tell us about the pleasures of going out there and trying to raise venture capital on terms that don't compromise your mission and leave you in control of your own destiny?
Pleasures is such a great word. It's definitely a pleasurable experience to ask people to give you money, of course, as Nick, I'm sure, could attest to. So definitely making the decision to make the switch over from bootstrapping and sort of being revenue first from the onset, and then going into the subscription kind of revenue model. I think I was kind of vehemently against starting early with venture capital. I think it was super important for me to kind of take this experiment of building in a niche space to ensure that we could gain the necessary attraction to build a true business, especially early on when I had first started following that model of, you know, typical Silicon Valley, let's go raise a ton of money and figure it out later. Deciding to do the reverse, really, because I was in J school and watching tons of media publications lose a ton of their value after having raised a lot of capital. And so it didn't seem like the smart move. It seemed like slow and steady, deliberate and intentional was going to be the most important and strategic move to also have as much control over what I was building, especially as I was kind of generally talking to investors who felt like, well, this is such a niche topic, you know, why wouldn't a mainstream publication cover this? And I'm like, but they haven't, and they've been around for 100+ years. So that's okay. We'll go ahead and keep doing what we're doing. And then fast forward, and now we get the phone calls of legacy publications asking us how we've been building. So I think there's kind of there's definitely a kind of a prescient move there that I didn't know what would kind of happen. And now as we continue to grow and make deeper investments in our software that we're building out, in addition to just generally needing to expand our team and capacity so that we can cover more ground, the need for venture capital as a tool is definitely something that we are prioritizing as we go into this next year and try to, again, cover more ground and increase operations.
So you've sort of solved the access to capital problem by just demonstrating something first and then talking from a relative position of strength to the people with the money. Elizabeth, I want to ask you about this capital question. I mean, what you're doing is, you know, you've kind of touched on everything here, right? With Chalkbeat, you just worked your ass off with something small and then grew it into something really big, but with a different kind of capital, right? With access to sort of philanthropic funding, or what you're now calling philanthropic venture funding. And then you've sort of built on that with American Journalism Project, where the idea, again, is to sort of change the nature of access to capital while helping news organizations work through at least some sustainability issues by trying out different revenue streams. So how, if this is a success, right? If we're talking about this big ambitious project 5 years from now, how will you change the game in terms of access to capital, particularly when it comes to local and sort of topic specific news that's for the civic good?
I think that one of the biggest challenges here is that the capital markets have failed us. There's not great solutions for the pressing civic journalism that we need, that connects communities to each other, but also outside of our bubbles. We've only seen capital markets deliver us kind of, vulturistic, you said the rapacious owners who break things. And then we have these like slivers of hope that are such slivers. They're great. I love the work that's happening, that's possible, but it's too small, too small. The need that we have for great news that connects people is far outpacing the sources of support for it and the institutions that we need to rebuild. So I think for me, in 5 years, we will have been successful. My mission will feel successful if we have a broad acknowledgement that we have to think beyond the way traditional capital markets work to fund media, that media is a public good that needs to be funded through a mix of sources of support. And philanthropy is going to have to lead the way if we want to have any of the strong civic components to learn the best lessons of the commercially viable media properties. And so for me, my journey, what that looked like is, I was able through Chalkbeat, building Chalkbeat, very much like Sherrell, the journey you're describing. We had, grabbed our corner of the universe through a meager amount of startup support to prove something. To prove that there was a value. And we did it against the curve of what every other media company was saying was most important or interesting, or the way to think about local news. We said it's not going to look like the traditional newspaper with many multiple topics serving one geography. It's going to look like a single topic across many geographies. This is the way the commercial parts of local news have been structured, and we have to do that for the civic parts. We've steadily and very scrappily proved the concept, and now we are out seeking, for the first time, growth capital. AJP is my effort to say everyone needs growth capital, not just Chalkbeat. We need to build a whole new generation of institutions to fill the gaps, and we need to treat this problem as an institution building problem, not a short-sighted problem of very programmatic focused 1 month to 1 month enterprises.
Is there any tension that you see between the sort of need to like push them along the learning curve towards the sustainability building that you're describing, and the sort of just the fact that they're starting off dependent on philanthropic capital? Is there, how do you find the balance?
So I think we have to redefine sustainability. What do we mean by sustainability in this context? In the context of news, when so much of news is a public good, which will, in my view, and I think this is just the verdict of our world, will not be supported commercially. It just will not be supported commercially. It's an accident of history that we had commercial support subsidizing the fourth estate of our democracy. And so sustainability means that we find as a society a way that we keep large institutions viably going for a while. There are other kinds of things in our society that are also public goods that we find ways to support in a long haul way as institutions that are not dependent on any single one person's generosity in any single moment, or the vicissitudes of the markets, but instead have stable and diverse support. So first of all, let's define sustainability as the outcome, not a specific kind of money. Philanthropy in our country has a long history of doing maybe too much where the government doesn't, depending on what your view of it is, or maybe not enough. But philanthropy can be the majority sustainer of large sectors, entire sectors of our community. So there's nothing, in my view, wrong with philanthropy being the way we start. Philanthropy can also be the way we end. I think there is certainly like a science and an art that we're all going to have to hone of figuring out how we can place really big bets as quickly as our society needs it, but in a way that is not going to kind of doom people to the too big to fail early failure problem that Sherrell referenced, of some of our friends in media who had really cool, shiny new ideas that just burst and aren't sustaining. So yes, like it's not going to be easy, but I think the first step is making a commitment to be much, much bolder.
So Kaizar, you actually, I think you've probably got a very interesting and maybe unique on this panel view on this, because you've sort of been on two sides of this sort of growth equation. You were with Cal Matters, and now you're with Disney. And so, I want to go back, a little bit to what Nick described before as product market fit. What are some of the things you've seen with these that work in terms of creating revenue with these big going concern media properties that could have application in the sort of for smaller and mid-sized publishers, for the kind of hard news industry? What are your sort of learnings since you got to Disney that might usefully filter over to other kinds of journalism?
Well, look, I think a lot of what Elizabeth said is super important. So I want to talk a little bit about Cal Matters first. This idea that the capital markets have failed, particularly local journalism, I think that's not. I don't think that's a particularly controversial statement. But that is the fact of the matter, right? Is that there is a mismatch between the value that we need to create in America and in the world, and what the capital markets understand as value, right? And we're Columbia Business School, so I want to talk a little bit about the leadership you need, and the entrepreneurial leadership, the board leadership you need to navigate that mismatch. Because to your point, Josh and Nick, about there's a lot about how like Silicon Valley best practices that is extremely valuable for all of us trying to build a richer, new, local news ecosystem and just news ecosystem. This idea of being extremely audience centric, understanding product market fit analytically and qualitatively, right? Like as a leader, as someone who's like trying to launch something, understand, like being able to see that what you are making in the world is creating value. It may not be monetary value, but it's like creating quantitative value. And you can just sort of like, you have your touchstones, right? Like that's what I rely upon, like when I was at Cal Matters and at Disney, to be like, are we actually doing something right here? Like, it's the social media posts and like those sorts of things where you're like, yes, this is kind of working. And, I think it's extremely disorienting when there isn't, when you're dealing with a mismatch situation where like money's not coming in, but you do have product market. You can kind of see that, right? And, it is the philanthropic infrastructure that we need, that American Journalism Project and a whole others are doing. I think it's great that they're there. They actually need to do a much better job of supporting leadership within that mismatch. And we need to be training our leaders and our future entrepreneurs to sort of stay focused in the midst of that. So that's like sort of mismatch of thoughts there. You know, I also don't like in operationally what we do with the ABC News properties at Disney. We don't leave any ideas off the table from a revenue generation perspective. Like there are a lot of possibilities here, but I think getting good at knowing when things are just clearly not going to cut it for you and cutting those quickly. That's again, it's a leadership and like decision-making skill set that is hard when you don't have you know, good data and maybe good board management and those sorts of things. But these entrepreneurs have to get good at it. We all have to get good at that and saying like, you know what, this one just makes no sense for us. From a secular perspective, look, I think the advertising business is extremely difficult, particularly for local news entities. There is a mismatch. I mean, the fluke of history with the newspaper bundle, I mean, that is absolutely a thing. And, you know, so looking at more direct to consumer type models is something, you know, we need to keep poking and prodding. And there's a lot out there beyond membership and subscriptions just for access to content, as Nick was saying. You know, there's if you can build trust with audiences, real, genuine trust, there are a lot of places to go with that.
So let's talk about that. And Nick, I want to put you, you know, on the spot to get a little bit more specific about what you were describing before as access to content and value and membership. You know, it's not a zero-sum game, right? It's a false binary to talk about like gating or sort of just rattling the tin cup. There are shades of gray in between, and yet these are real questions, and there's real tension around these questions in newsrooms, right? You want to make as what you do as widely as available to as wide an audience as possible. But it's objectively the case among a cohort like yours that the more easily defined the member proposition, the more money they can command for membership. So how do you advise publishers when they sort of come to you and ask about how to deal with that access question as it relates to the proposition of having sustainable revenue coming in from that membership or subscription proposition?
Yeah, and if I understand the question correctly, you're thinking really in the context of local news?
Well, yes. So Pico type clients, right? So in a lot of cases, that's local news or topic specific news. The paywall question.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to local news, I think something Elizabeth said earlier really resonates. Something we've always believed in, that news is a public service. So there is this tension between, optimizing product market fit and coming up with this really lucrative pricing model that is quote unquote sustainable, and also making sure that anyone who wants, needs, deserves that information has access to it. Pico doesn't have all the answers to that. I think that does require some, there needs to be some participation from government to that end, and philanthropy, right? But we need to make sure that we are not creating information news deserts by pursuing membership models. That's really critical. Now, outside of local news, take Defector, for example, reading tongue-in-cheek commentary on sports. It is more of a for-profit effort there. You pay for it because it's entertaining. It's something that you're passionate about. It's something you get a lot of value out of. So the access tension varies depending on the type of audience, the type of product you're talking about.
Well, Sibel, talking about the organizations that you've been, let's even just talk about the the cohort you were talking about at the at the start. They're different from each other. how do you advise them in terms of membership or subscription propositions and how they should think about the sort of opportunities and drawbacks of gating some of their content?
Yeah, so actually earlier this year, we launched the Digital Growth Program, which is our attempt at helping news organizations navigate. And actually what Kaizar also said, like a lot of times what we see is news organizations say, oh my God, like there's all of these different things, let me do this and this and this. And it's very important to prioritize and focus so that like you don't have to do everything for everyone all at once, but really figure out what works for you given your organization. So as part of the Digital Growth Program, we tried to simplify business decisions into 5 pillars. So advertising revenue, reader revenue, data, product, and audience. And across each of these, I think earlier Nick said something that's so accurate, like there isn't really a one-size-fits-all solution. At the same time, there are frameworks that can help you, prioritize and evaluate what in your case may work best. So in terms of reader revenue, we actually launched this 5 workshop series, a playbook and labs where we work with groups of like 10 to 12 publishers at a time and really tackle problems as a community. And a couple of things that we've seen, like while trying to prioritize between the two, is really first, defining your value proposition, which we've talked about a little bit, but questions like defining what you stand for consistently and clearly, like deciding what you should do and what you can't do, like for everyone, articulating like why people should choose you as a news organization, and distinguishing yourself from your competitors, developing a brand strategy, and then hiring the right people that can support each of these elements. And actually, we work with a lot of different, industry leaders, news associations, organizations, etc. I really like the Membership Puzzle Project, for example, created this framework, and they, ask people to say, okay, can you define something for your organization by saying, we are the first ones to XYZ, or we are the only ones to XYZ, or we are the best at XYZ. So obviously these stories can be different from everyone, but I think in the journey of figuring out how do you launch a membership or subscription model, et cetera, I think defining some of these questions are quite important.
Great. And if there's time, Sherrell, could you just weigh in on this? Because it's you're coming at this from a very specific place. You've checked a couple of the very important boxes that Sibel just articulated in terms of defining yourself and meeting a real need in the market. You are simultaneously attempting to strike an important blow for diversity in an area of coverage that's been notably undiverse. But a big part of the model is essentially enterprise subscription to this kind of these various data sets and tools and now software that you're developing. So how do you see that mission balance?
Absolutely. I think that there's utility in understanding that we're living in a very different kind of world, specifically one that is looking towards accountability amongst those who have traditionally been underrepresented, overlooked, and in many cases, from an institutional perspective, have been historically discriminated against in different kinds of ways. And so as we look to the future of business leadership and the need for intelligent reporting and analysis to help business leaders make better decisions that are inclusive, that are informed, very well informed by data, be that historical or present data. We see ourselves really fitting into that spot very well, primarily because, again, the coverage has been lacking. And so being able to be that forefront of knowledge and resource and examination for those business leaders, even when I say business, I mean across the board, from public sector to nonprofit sector to those that even in academia who subscribe and use our information to help better inform practices. We kind of accidentally stumbled upon these particular users who were telling us, like, here's how I'm implementing this within the workplace. And so that kind of, again, by happenstance, we started to see how folks were using our reporting and realized going into the enterprise model is where we're going to achieve long-term sustainability, and still being able to serve, cover, and connect communities of color, ecosystem leaders, and emerging hubs that represent communities of color as well, who of course are looking for that level of representation, but being able to again provide that utility for quote unquote outsiders who are responsible for making the kinds of business decisions, investments, hiring when we think about workforce and the future of the workforce, those individuals being equipped to better understand the landscape in which their decisions drastically affect the economic routes and opportunities that communities across the board are affected by on a day-to-day and a generational basis.
Great. Thank you very much. I think our organizers want to do some questions from the audience now.
Yes. Thanks, Josh. And thanks everyone for submitting your questions to the Q&A. If you have others, feel free to add them in now. So one of the first questions is, I think the first question is really around, government funded news, and is there a role for government funded news? And what about this sort of balance between opinion and facts, and where do you think that the right place for that exists? And I'll hand it over to you, Elizabeth, to start out.
Sure. I believe that we don't have to separate news as a special thing from other public good externality problems that we face as a society. And so we can say that, I, as a taxpayer, for sure, would love to subsidize local news that has a civic nature. And also I would really love to subsidize local news that is editorially independent, that is not controlled by government. And so I think that I'm not alone in holding that view. I think there's lots of different ways that our tax dollars can subsidize local news. We have increasingly been doing some advocacy work on this front and proposing solutions. It's not going to ever, in my opinion, be the only source of support. It can never capture the control, but I see no reason why we shouldn't find every way we can to secure editorially independent institutions with our public dollars.
If I can also jump in here as well, as I start to learn more of the history of legacy Black and Latinx media organizations as well, and we look at the history, particularly in small towns, with these institutions being burned down during racially challenged times, which of course, I guess we're never not in racially challenged times, but literally these news sources and keys and information that were useful in helping to examine some of the challenges of racial tensions. These institutions like Ida B. Wells, again, whose newspaper was burned to the ground, I think there is a space for government to come to a reckoning of these institutions that were destroyed, and where we see significant underfunding of Black and Brown newsrooms, where there should be some subsidies specifically to these institutions that lost significant opportunities to grow and sustain at the hands of racial discrimination and domestic terrorism.
That makes sense. And I think this next question is also something you can touch on, Sherrell, around how can smaller or newer media organizations test product market fit? And how do you recommend building and cultivating a core audience?
I think it always starts with experimentation and being able to iterate on that and running small experiments in order to see what fits. That really is kind of how I built The Plug, going from a daily newsletter that I did as I was working full time, and just seeing if there was an audience for it, not spending any more than $10 for a domain name and a free MailChimp account, and kind of growing from there, and just kind of following that lean startup methodology where you are prototyping first, putting something out there that might might be ugly, and then sort of refining and reiterating as the evidence and the data supports growth and investment opportunities. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question? It just escaped me.
How do you recommend building and cultivating a core audience?
I think there's so many different kinds of ways. We really try to tap into kind of the personable ability of our community. And traditionally, when prior to the pandemic, it was hosting conversations at main tech conferences where we knew that there would be subsets of conversations specifically with underrepresented founders and techies as part of things like a South by Southwest or a CES, cultivating a sense of trust and transparency where people know our journalists, people know me, they know our stories. And so trying to infuse that into the way in which we provide coverage, the way that we speak to our audience through our weekly briefings, sharing those personal factoids and stories of our own experiences within tech, there's a sense of relatability there. And so I think that, especially in a niche space, there's much more room to have depth and to build those personal relationships. And of course, social media gives us access in a different frame, right? So all of our readers and followers who've been supporting our work for years, we're on Twitter talking to each other. They're sending DMs and screenshots and sharing news and information. They're helping us with our reporting by using Signal to give us access to different information that we would have not ever had access to had they not felt that they trusted us and had a personal and accessible relationship with us.
Great. I think something we keep coming back to in this conversation is the idea of trust. And this next question, I think, really tries to get at the heart of that around philanthropy-funded news. And how do we ensure journalistic integrity when you are also being supported by, only a few large funders? And I think, Elizabeth, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and then anybody else, feel free to jump in as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, my career, I started out realizing the challenges of commercial business models when I saw the way that major advertisers directed coverage at even very mainstream publications, both just in the topics that are considered safe enough to cover and also in actually what topics get the most space. Philanthropy is no different in that it's money with an opinion, and from advertising, it's money with an opinion. And there is no money without an opinion, honestly. All we can do is build the right guardrails so that we don't accept money that is going to direct coverage. And we also aren't, pretending as consumers that we can assume that there's any pure money here. What we can do as a consumer, though, is say, does this institution operate with the right guardrails or not? And I mean, I'm sad that we are requiring so much of all of us as news consumers that we have to do that discernment. I think there's a lot better ways we could get around that. But the bottom line is you have to ask, is the news publisher doing the right guardrails? And I can say for sure, as a publisher of nonprofit journalism, we have never once let a philanthropist direct our coverage, and we have walked away from major dollars just to stand by that principle, which is absolutely the right business decision, and in addition to the right decision for us from a sort of social good point of view. We need the trust with our readers that Sherrell just really beautifully described, and if we ever walk away from a story for reasons of fear, we will lose that trust with our readers, as so many brands have.
Great, thank you for that. Josh, I'm gonna hand it over to you to close us out with the last question.
Do we have one from the audience that we can answer? I've seen a couple that are great, but is there any?
Yeah, I go for it.
All right,
I think both of the ones at the top are pretty compelling.
Okay, well, there's one of the questions was just about what what emerging source of revenue we're most excited about, and my sort of non-answer is that I'm most excited about the revenue models that are most diverse and therefore, most resilient in the face of the vicissitudes that we've all been talking about. And then, of course, my own bias is that they be the ones that leave the newsroom leaders and journalism founders in the cases where that's applicable in maximum control over their own destiny, right? To prevent the very kinds of things that Elizabeth's describing when undue influence creeps in. The reason this has been such a cool panel for me to be a part of is that every single person on this panel has touched on some of the things that are going to be the salvation of the new and burgeoning generation of news organizations that are figuring things out about these these different revenue models. But to paraphrase Nick, there isn't one size that fits all, and that's super important to keep in mind. There's no silver bullets. The pendulum swings way back and forth. And, I think the journalism organizations that are going to be in the best position to last and be in the best shape years from now are the ones that are figuring out sustainable revenue streams like readership revenue, membership, but who know how to tap into venture philanthropy where that's available, can get into some of the old revenue streams where it's still applicable, and and remain in control of what they're doing. Thank you all very much for having me, and I'm super reachable if there are any other questions. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. This was awesome. I'm just going to close this out today, and then I will let you all go. I just want to say thank you to each of you so much for taking the time to share your thoughts and your wisdom and your insights. Really appreciate everyone who put in a lot of work to make today possible, and everybody behind the scenes that you all don't get to see. And thank you to our participants for coming, asking great and hard questions. Really appreciate that. We hope that you will continue to join us for these important conversations. You can see the save the date on the screen in front of you. We're covering a diverse set of topics that across sectors that have social and environmental implications. So thank you for coming. We hope to see you in the future, and have a great rest of your Friday.